In a small village in the hills of Piacenza is situated a Buddhist center of the Mahasi tradition, where they hold Vipassana meditation retreats. I had heard about it from a friend but had never been drawn to this sitting meditation until one day when I got a message from inside me that it was time to try it out. We were about 25 people, a mixture of first-timers and seasoned meditators coming from places as far as the UK and the Middle East, and also locals from the town of Piacenza itself. The setup has refined over its 30 years history so as to run seamlessly. Friday afternoon arrival and orientation involves settling into your room, choosing your spot for meditation and for meals, which stay the same for the duration. This reduces any need for unnecessary thinking and also creates the foundation of Sangha, which I'll come back to. We each have one job to help with the smooth running of the retreat, such as ringing the bell to notify wake-up time, which was 5 a.m., or the beginning of a session, helping to clean up after a meal, sweeping a communal area, or taking out the rubbish. Whichever job you were allocated would take up about 15 minutes of a day. I found that the rhythm of the daily job offered a fresh outlet, a form of meditating through an everyday activity. After our orientation and house rules, which include maintaining an attitude of loving kindness, no talking or eye contact, no phones, doing things one at a time with mindfulness, we had our first evening snack together in silence, followed by our first Dhamma talk by our teacher. This is when the teacher shares pearls of wisdom about the practice from texts and personal experience. It was primarily through these talks that I began to catch glimpses of what the practice was pointing toward. Each day I found myself able to apply a little more, building on what I had learnt the day before. The Mahasi tradition follows an alternation of sitting and walking meditation. The timetable for our Vipassana was as follows: 5 to 6 a.m. wake-up and walking meditation, 6 to 7 sitting, 7 to 8 breakfast, 8 to 9 walking, 9 to 10 sitting, 10 to 11 walking, 11 to 12 sitting, 12 to 1:30 lunch and rest, 1:30 to 2 walking, 2 to 3 sitting, 3 to 4 walking, 4 to 5 sitting, 5 to 6 tea break, snack and walking meditation, 6 to 8 Dhamma talk and walking meditation, 8 to 9 metta practice, and for the hardcore practitioners, 9 to 10 sitting meditation. Thankfully, I only really looked at the timetable a few days before arriving and thought it best not to entertain any of the thoughts that were arising. This was a good tactic which I also used when I noticed that they only had instant coffee, but it was actually fine. In the sitting practice, you're taught to observe the rising and falling of the breath. At first it may seem dull, but continued focus helps penetrate the superficial rising and falling, revealing variations such as length, ease, the gap between inhale and exhale. Though familiar from yoga, this becomes a much deeper process when sustained for hours each day. You quickly notice how the mind wanders, attaching to sensory input and associative stories. When this happens, and it happens a lot, we were taught to note the distraction and return to the breath. Planning, or narrating were my usual suspects. This simple yet profound practice creates distance between awareness and thought, helping reveal that our thoughts and emotions are not who we are. Then there was the walking meditation, which involves selecting a path of around 20 steps and moving slowly back and forth along it. As the practice deepens, presence grows, with each step revealing its own uniqueness. The shifting sensations, the subtle movement of the foot, the quiet intention to move. Gradually the pace slows down, right down, and awareness expands. It offers a welcome shift from sitting, helping to lift the mind from states of torpor. It also cultivates awareness in the body, which is always the primary object of observation in both sitting and walking. Finally, metta meditation is the practice of cultivating loving kindness. This session began with chants of goodwill, first toward oneself, then gradually extending to others and all beings. After the chanting, it continued quietly. To make sure we were on the right track, we had a 10-minute interview every other day with our teacher. This really helped with keeping any novices from feeling overwhelmed and keeping the seasoned practitioners from having to hear beginner instructions. It also helped with personal fine-tuning of the practice. One of the key teachings was this: we are not trying to change anything. A definition of mindfulness is an open and receptive state, accepting what is. Whether it was discomfort, fatigue, or a flood of thoughts, the task was to observe. Even pain was just another phenomenon to witness, not good or bad, but simply arising and passing. By softening aversion and attraction, we were learning the first steps toward reducing suffering. On a practical note, when a sensation like discomfort, cramp, or the urge to escape arises, we were advised to simply tune into it, to observe it without resistance. The goal isn't to eliminate the feeling, but to meet it with curiosity, softening the instinct to label it as good or bad. Often, we discover that these judgments are learned reactions, conditioning, not inherent truths. By staying present with the sensation, neither pushing it away or clinging to it, we create space for it to be just as it is. In doing so, what once felt unbearable may soften, revealing how much of our suffering comes from our struggle against what is, rather than the experience itself. On the first day, I kept nodding off and I realized I was dreaming. Opening my eyes led to strange visuals in the floor patterns. I hadn't learnt yet that focusing on bodily sensations helped anchor awareness when the breath felt too subtle to follow. In those early days, every hour of sitting felt like two. Many thoughts were elaborate fantasies, some sparked by sounds, which spiraled into hopes for an emergency that would mean evacuation and escape. Yet every time I considered skipping a session, another thought would override it. There's nothing else to do. So I always showed up, except on a couple of nights when I let myself catch up on sleep. Once I had overcome the sleepiness, I felt a new zeal towards the sitting, and the Dhamma talk of one particular evening filled me with inspiration. During this talk, I heard about sati, which is the Pali word for presence, and the idea of seeing her as a dear friend who is not upset when you forget her, and always right there with you when you remember her again. I found this idea so touching. It's from the book Satipatthana Meditation, a practice guide by Bhikkhu Analayu. It reminded me of my relationship with my dog. So, early on the third day, I took this idea and I said to my dear friend Sati, let's observe the mind. But at that moment, perhaps because things act differently when they're being observed, it was as if the mind hid from me. There was nothing there. And as I looked, surprisingly at nothing, another voice said, okay, well at some point you have to let go of the act of observation also. And in that very moment, it was as if I had jumped off a cliff and was free diving into nothing and everything. Natasha disappeared and I sat there in the expanse of unconfined thoughtlessness. As I stepped outside, it amplified and I became the trees and the flowers. Tears rolled down and my breath, unrestricted, inhaled all of it. I'm well aware that trying to recreate such an experience is futile. Any desire to do so only pushes it further out of reach. Strangely, after the elevated inward experience of all and everything, the eating, walking, and sitting meditations became more challenging. Was it consciousness opening up to reveal more of what's always there, and so having to navigate through more? Whatever the answer, it's a good lesson to steer one away from gloating. In one of the Dhamma talks, our teacher explained how to observe the objects that pass through the mind. And after that, I began to better understand what I was supposed to be doing. When we observe without adding meaning, what we hear, like people talking, is at its most basic just sound hitting the eardrum. The rest is what the mind adds from past conclusions or experiences. Emotions, too, are essentially impulses we've reinforced through repetition, turning them into habitual responses. By applying the noting technique, we create some distance from the incoming sensation and begin to see things with more clarity. Emotions are natural, but we tend to identify with them quickly. This is where suffering begins, because we mistake these passing emotions for who we are. But we are not our emotions. They're less tangible, which makes them slippery, harder to catch or observe with detachment. But then I did. I recall the first emotion I managed to observe without attaching to. It was fear, and I saw it as a streak of white light shooting up and away from me. This was interesting. It felt more like a passing energetic pattern that had nothing to do with me and helped confirm my previous statement that we are not our emotions. I can see how more of this practice could over time allow me to rest in a space undisturbed from the pullings of emotional turbulence. Who doesn't want that? As the days progressed, I thought about how acts of terror and other horrible acts against others were in fact acts of unconsciousness. For if we take responsibility for our own actions, and we are aware as Vipassana teaches us to be, how can we act against another? I then thought that perhaps anyone who wanted to rule a country should first do a Vipassana retreat, and found out that actually this in fact used to be the case in Burma. Over the following days and after the retreat, I began to observe emotions in this way. They all took on different shapes, sometimes bubbling, sometimes pulsating. All movement creates vibration, and vibration is sound. I used to teach this in my sound classes, but now the concept was taking on a new meaning. The manifest world seemed to be made up of reactions shaped by a partial view of the whole, seen from the limited angle of an individual viewpoint. How can this be reality? This raises the deeper question: who is reacting? Is there really an I? I don't have the answers, but what I do know is that much of the conflict in the world comes from over-identification with self-centered beliefs, which obscures the greater picture. The wonderful thing about attending a retreat like this is that the others with you play a large role in your ability to cultivate mindfulness. The teacher and seasoned practitioners help hold the group together. Through their unwavering practice, they act as role models, offering silent encouragement when things get tough. Everyone, simply by not communicating and focusing on their own work of meditation, bearing their own struggles, becomes a mirror for us. Instead of offloading our feelings onto others, we learn to bear them ourselves. We take responsibility for what we need, even in small ways, like not being able to ask someone to pass the salt or fetch another slice of bread. If we are natural helpers, we notice the impulse to help, but do not act on it. In this restraint, we learn to see these impulses clearly, without judgment, just as they are. On one particular afternoon, I observed the view of the hills covered in a blanket of moss green, and as I looked, I had no opinion. I was able to observe it for what it was with no interference, and I was completely free. Coming home, one can see how the practice and other practitioners are a support to this state of blissful contentment. Now the trick is to maintain it when back in the real world. Until the next retreat.